Good morning. This is the final lecture for the course Korean Government and Politics, taught in the spring of 2021. Today's topic is Protest Society in South Korea. And today's instruction date is June 7th, 2021. Before we move forward, just a reminder that this is the final lecture and it's recorded due to the onset of coronavirus on campus. Thursday morning at regular class time, 10:30 a.m., we will do a live Zoom session for a review of the semester, preparation of the final test, and any questions you might have. Let's move forward. This image is one of the most evocative images of contemporary protest in Korea. So we're going to take a look at the history of protest, the more recent history of protest, and then discuss our understandings of protest. I'm going to slide me in here for a moment so you can remember what I look like. But most of the slides after this are kind of full because I use a larger text. So you won't see me after this. Okay, good morning. Alright, so we are going to focus on the period 1988 and following, up to the present day. In fact, protests before 1988 were much more violent. These protests were usually based on one of two themes: democracy and anti-authoritarianism, or labor protest, organized labor, union labor protest. And it is to be sure that in many occasions the labor forces supported the democracy movement, and the democracy movements sometimes supported the labor protest, the labor movement. But these really were two separate phenomena. We can go back as far as the Park Chung-hee era, even before Park Chung-hee, and I'll mention a little bit later the 1961 protests, which were a time of unrest, as we remember from our earlier classes. There was a point in time at which student protest drove out the first president of Korea, Lee Seung-man. And that is kind of the starting point for many histories of protest in Korea. But if you want to go further back, of course, you could go to the 1919 protest against the Japanese, the protest in the 1890s, the labor reform protest. We could go back further and further. But in this class, we're going to basically address modern, contemporary protest. In particular, we're going to look at the Korean phenomenon, the candlelight protest. And we're going to try to find what these candlelight protests mean. We're going to look for deeper understandings. So now I'm going to slide myself off of this picture, and we'll move to the next slide. So in 1988, more than 20,000 students from 80 colleges and universities were out in the streets. This was perhaps the last major demonstration for 30 years. I mean, truly major demonstration for 30 years that was at its heart political, democracy driven. 20,000 students doesn't sound like so much compared to numbers that we're going to hear later. But this was still an authoritarian time. Even though Chun Doo-hwan was out of office, No Tae-woo was legally elected in a very close race. No Tae-woo was another army guy who was pretty much handpicked by Chun Doo-hwan and was a collaborator in the military takeover, the coup d'etat, that put Chun Doo-hwan into office. So No Tae-woo was seen as the last legacy of the military. And so at that time, protest was very dangerous. The army was in control, and if you protested, it wasn't just combat police, the riot police that were on the streets. It was soldiers with guns. So these students were demanding the arrest of former President Chun Doo-hwan. And they clashed. They fought with riot policemen in campus rallies on the streets. Why? Well, President No was criticized for being too slow to investigate. Too slow to investigate corruption charges. Right? Corruption. The bane of Korea for many, many years. Companies had this informal tax where they really had to support the sitting president and his party. And some of that money went into supporting, political elections, but some of that went into the president and his family's pockets. And we know that those trials are ongoing. That ultimately Chun Doo-hwan and No Tae-woo both were convicted and went to jail and got out of jail. And Chun still hasn't paid money that the court said he owed. Okay, so the protests were because No Tae-woo wasn't initiating those criminal proceedings. And also, they had just barely started investigating the Gwangju uprising and the president's role in the Gwangju uprising. Did he order troops to shoot, etc.? Again, an issue that 30 years later, 33 years later, I guess, now it's 2021, still is unresolved. So the students were on the street. In 1992, we had a couple of new things happening, and one of them will surprise you. The new thing happening in 1992, some would say, is the beginning of candlelight protest. Now, the candlelight protest could be the few, or it could be many, as we will see. But this protest was very interesting. It was only a relatively small group of people. These people were not protesting politics. They were protesting fees to get online. Because prior to this time, the company that was providing online services was doing it for free. This was the Hightel network, which if any of you ever experienced. I don't think any of you have. You're too young. It was an extremely limited internet. It was more of what nowadays we would probably call an intranet. It was the very beginnings of an internet. There was no nice web browser. It was a contained community. In 1992, there were probably less than 100,000 people who could access the internet this way. And if you knew how, you could get onto the wider internet outside of Korea. But basically, most people ended up only communicating in Korean in this mini community. And it was mostly university students. And one researcher has suggested that this was the first indication of the power of netizens. I think that's probably in a very extreme statement. Probably not really true. Netizens? There wasn't such a sense, I don't think, at that time. But perhaps it is a first step for a discussion of internet and Korea. And again, it's very interesting that it was a protest about fees, but not exactly the fact that there were fees, because basically it was a club before, where people paid a small membership fee to the club. But the way the fees system was restructured. This happened because the company that was providing internet access at the beginning was a newspaper, the economic newspaper. And that internet service got sold to a different company, and that other new company decided to make some money. So it was an economic protest. 1996. This is a personal remark. This is my own experience. From the autumn of 1995 to the spring of 1996, well, until September of 1996, I taught at Gyeongnam University in Masan. And I discovered in the spring that the Masan area students had an annual protest. And everyone knew it was coming. It was sort of a rite of passage that freshmen went to university and they expected to get in a good demo. But this demonstration on one level was a commemoration of the Busan-Masan April 1961 protest. And if you remember, it was these protests that originated in Busan and Masan that overthrew the first president of the Republic of Korea, Lee Sin-man. Well, by the time we got to 1996, which was 35 years later, a lot of that political sentiment had gone away. Kim Young-sam was president. There was no doubt that he was a legal president. This was before IMF. There weren't a whole lot of good reasons to protest. This was really students having a good time. And yet what I heard from the third and fourth year students, especially those guys who had gone to the army and come back, so they had experienced demonstrations 5 or 6 years earlier, was that there were no good demos anymore. That there wasn't more breakage, and that there wasn't more tear gas. But getting tear gassed was a rite of passage. It was a way of saying, yeah, I'm an adult, I am a true university student, I got gassed. And my reaction to that was, here I am on campus, up the hill, probably almost a kilometer away from where there were any police, and probably 100 or 200 meters higher, and yet I'm in the classroom with a few students, and my eyes are tearing just a little bit. I can smell the tear gas. It makes my nose wrinkle, makes me feel itchy. I knew it was tear gas. and the students complained there's no good demos. Okay. A little bit later in 1996, we saw one of the last big worker protests. This was a 2-month protest, and it was the largest organized strike in history to that time in Korea. These were workers in the automotive and shipbuilding industries, and they put down their tools. They put down their tools. They refused to work. Well, we have labor strikes in most countries around the world, and when workers refuse to work, they put down their tools, they go outside the gates of the factory, and they try to block the gates. They don't want temporary workers or other of their colleagues to go in and work. They're shutting down the factory. This happens sometimes. But in Korea, it's a little bit different story, because labor strikes in Korea were famous for damage. The workers would intentionally damage equipment such that they felt the company's going to pay. Now, mind you, at this time, when workers were on strike, they still got paid. That was kind of part of the environment in Korea. Workers got paid even when they were striking, and they damaged company equipment. So when the strike was over, then the factory still wasn't working because they had to repair the damage. So strikes were an extremely expensive proposition. These workers were protesting a law that would make firing workers easier. And the new laws would limit the right for unions to organize. That is, in workplaces where there weren't already unions, it would be harder for the unions to enter. Yet at this time in Korea, and actually almost still today, the laws have changed some. Workers in manufacturing basically had a lifetime guarantee to their job. When you got hired at a big company as a cleaning woman, factory worker, office worker, the understanding was it was a job for life. This was the same system as from Japan. Job for life. So there were no real big surprises here. Layoffs were illegal, and Korean workers were relatively the best paid in Asia. I mean, Japanese workers got paid more per hour, but the cost of living was higher, everything was more expensive, so there's an argument that the workers were the best paid in Asia. And if not the best, then second best compared to Japan. So Japan and Korea had this employment environment, and Japan started to change about the same time too. Well, that failed. I mean, the workers were basically successful, but not so much later we found ourselves in IMF, what Koreans call IMF, the Asian Economic Crisis. Korea had to go to this International Monetary Fund to ask for money to be able to pay its bills on time. And the IMF was following what's often known as the Washington Consensus, this economic concept that there are certain ways to recover from recession. There are certain things that are good, certain things that are bad. Now, this is 1998. 20 plus years later, many of those assumptions are deeply questioned. Not just in Asia, not just in any country that has had economic difficulties, but around the world. But this was the economic concept coming from the early 1950s through, let's say, 2005, 2010. This was the understanding of economics. So if a country can't pay its bills, well, there's a couple of reasons. And the solutions to that are to trim the fat, to get rid of the waste that is in the society. And one of them was that companies had too many workers, especially office workers. Too many office workers. So the IMF forced the government to change laws, and one of those changes was to basically pass the laws that the workers had protested 18 months earlier. Well, in protest, tens of thousands of workers walked off their jobs. Could have been a lot more, but some were already fired, and others were afraid that if they walked off the job, that they protested, they'd get fired. But in this time, people understood the economy was tough. And it wasn't just the big companies that were pushing government to make these changes. So the protests were much more polite. There was far less damage. This was not a protest against the companies. This was not a protest against government supporting the companies. This was really a protest against IMF rules, which people understood were being forced on the country from overseas. So these protests were against IMF, against layoffs, and against the use of temporary workers. That is, we fire our permanent workers and then we hire temporary workers at less pay for the time that we need them. Maybe a year or two, we have a contract to build a ship, we hire the workers, then we don't have another ship to build. Go home, don't need you. Under the old system, the shipyard had to pay workers even when they had no work. And so this was the challenge at that time. 1998. In 2002, there was an automobile accident. Not exactly an automobile. A large U.S. Army vehicle, something like a troop carrier. No one questions it was an accident. Going through a town on regular routine military procedures. One large carrier couldn't see a couple of middle school girls who were walking in the street because there was no sidewalk. And the girls got run over. Now, it was an accident, and people understood that. The protest was against the mishandling of the investigation. That the Korean government didn't do anything. Oh, it's an accident. No, it's the end. Korea doesn't really work that way. When there's an accident, somebody has to be at fault. Somebody has to pay blood money. Somebody has to apologize. But Americans don't think that way. They don't work that way. And the Korean government didn't push it. So the U.S. Army vehicle killed 2 kids. And in the trial for the accident, they basically said it was an accident. The 2 American soldiers who were in court, in the U.S. military court in Korea regarding the accident, were acquitted of manslaughter. Manslaughter means killing others. And there's voluntary and involuntary. I mean, I meant to do it, I didn't mean to do it. But they were exonerated. They were found not guilty of manslaughter, of causing death. And this generated a storm of protest. The protest was not just about a court decision, but a protest by many people who had objections to many things related to the U.S. military. Now, some have suggested that perhaps this was more of a mourning than a protest. Mourning is when you quietly or with tears and crying feel the death of someone. And mourning can last for years. If you lose a family member, it can be years and years, and maybe your lifetime, where you feel a deep loss. So some researchers have suggested that it wasn't really a harsh protest, that most of the protests were nonviolent, most of the protests were quiet. And in one particular large protest, people gathered in front of City Hall for a memorial concert. And then they marched to the U.S. Embassy. Why? The U.S. Embassy was only about a kilometer and a half from the old City Hall. The old City Hall had a big plaza in front. It was a good place to meet for protest. And they had a concert. So we can see that there were lots of people who were protesting in different ways. Now, 2004, several things took place. First of all, Roh Moo-hyun, who followed Kim Dae-jung as president and was another liberal, was impeached by the legislature. He was impeached because he had said words that indicated he supported his party in an upcoming election. And presidents aren't allowed to do that. Presidents are a civil servant, and civil servants aren't allowed to be political. And there was much protest by the conservatives about this. And if you remember looking at the chart many weeks ago when we talked about who was president and who controlled the legislature, well, the conservatives controlled the legislature. They managed to pass an impeachment. Impeachment means we need to have a trial. Okay? Impeachment doesn't block the president. But in Korea, the impeachment actually takes the president out of power, and the prime minister becomes a temporary president. But it doesn't actually kick out the president, and just until there's a trial, and then we change one way or another. Because of the impeachment by the legislature, people came out to protest against the legislature. But again, it was mostly peaceful. It was a candlelit protest, not a violent protest. In the same year, there was a gang rape in Media, in my town. Something like 50 high school boys, over the course of a year, raped one or two girls from Ulsan. And it's quite a long story, and it's quite complex. It's a mess. There were candlelight protests in Seoul, in Busan, in Daegu, calling for effective police investigation and punishment. Why? Because the police basically said, well, boys will be boys, and we don't want to ruin these boys' future. They were too young. They made a mistake, and so the police really didn't do anything. So there were lots of protests. Ultimately, still, not much happened. Right? Now, ultimately, not much happened. The boys basically got off. Their names were never said in public because it would ruin their future. And so, in fact, many discussions of candlelight protests in Korea never even mentioned this one. In 2008, Lee Myung-bak was president. Conservatives back in power. Well, near the end of the Roh Moo-hyun presidency, there was this mad cow disease problem in the United States and some other countries. A disease, BSE, brain encephalitis, something like that. Basically, it was a brain disease. And it ultimately, I'm not sure if it actually finally killed many cows, but it would cause cows to kind of like get very, very, very old and they couldn't stand up. And there were some videos of it. And over time they discovered that this disease that was in the brain could go into the bones, down the backbone, into the ribs. So it was called mad cow disease. And many countries then erected barriers and said, okay, we won't accept American meat, especially meat that's more than 2 years old, because this doesn't seem to impact younger cows. So meat from cow more than 2 years old, we don't accept it. They made these barriers. And of course that very much impacted Americans' ability to sell meat overseas, and selling beef overseas is an important trade asset for the United States. And Korea was one of the big buyers. Well, ultimately Korea bought a lot of meat from Australia, but also a lot of Koreans stopped eating beef because it was a beef thing. Some people were confused and they stopped eating pork also, but it was a beef thing. All right. So after a few years, the issue seemed to be under control in the U.S. Koreans still didn't want it. Lee Myung-bak went to the United States to meet with the U.S. president, and before he met with the president, he announced to Korea that we're going to allow inspected American beef back into Korea. It's basically under control. We can inspect it. We're going to re-import it. And people protested. More than 100,000 people came out one night to protest in a candlelight vigil. Vigil means you don't have to say anything. You just go out, sit with your candles. One reason why this was peaceful was that there wasn't a lot of noisy activism. Another reason this was peaceful was that it was the kind of protest where mothers went out with their children. The mothers went out because they said, we have to protect our children. Well, police don't much like to come out with sticks and tear gas when there are children and mothers. In fact, that's an old saying in Korea that you know the government has lost the issue when the mothers come out to protest. These protests were almost daily. They were almost entirely peaceful. Okay, so I would say that there probably hasn't been a year in Korea when there weren't protests, but we're going to look at the big ones. And of course, you guys are old enough now, you can remember the issues of the Sewol Ferry. Sewol. From 2014 to 2017, we can talk about the Sewol Ferry impact. The ferry and the things that happened afterwards. And these were mostly candlelight protests. Initially, protests were against the shipping company, because the more we learned about the shipping company, the more we learned that they had done bad things. It was a protest against the government in general, several various aspects. The inspectors who'd let ships go out, the inspectors who'd the response teams who didn't rescue children, questions about communications up and down from local to national and across the various services, the Navy, the police. Ultimately, it reached to the president's office for things that the president had not done and things the president had done related to the Sewol Ferry incident, that accident, and the days around it, and reaching far beyond that into her general working as president and, in fact, her daily life. The key issue ultimately became the missing hours of President Park. Korea likes to use this phrase, the golden time. It's used in other countries, but it's a little bit used more, I think, in Korea. This golden time when there is maximum chance for success. That after we pass this golden time, it's very unlikely that we'll be successful to rescue people, to save lives. And there were a number of hours in the middle of President Park Geun-hye's time that were unaccounted for. They weren't on her official time register. Nobody could say, or nobody would say, where she was, what she was doing. And this is at a time when people expected that the various government agencies would have communicated up to the Cheongwade, to the Blue House, to the president's executive residence and offices, and said, what do we do? As we've said in the past, Korea is very much a imperial presidency, a control tower type of government where decisions are made by the top boss. And if anything goes wrong, well, it's the top boss's fault. So at various times there were records showing, oh, a message was conveyed, or no, it wasn't, the president was told, or maybe she wasn't. So we were questioning, society was questioning what the president was told, what the president decided or didn't decide. People questioned the government safety officers at the scene. There were comments like rescue boats wouldn't approach the Sewolho because maybe they were afraid. That there was no coordination. That there were actually one part of government telling another part, no, don't do that. Okay? And again, as I mentioned before, a general sense of were the proper inspections done before? Were people paid off? Inspections meaning each time the ship leaves the harbor, there is an inspection for weight, for safety. Were those done? But also, when the ship was renovated years before, was it renovated according to plans, or did they do more to make the ship carry more? And were those plans actually approved properly? You know, Korea has a reputation of companies paying inspectors to approve things. So during this time, there was something called the Million Strong March. Nearly 1 million people marched in Seoul. This was the largest demonstration in almost 30 years. And it was a political demonstration. But unlike some other protests around Sewolho, this one was a party. Song, dance, celebration. But in this general time, 2014, 2017, increasingly there were protests calling for President Park Geun-hye to resign from the presidency. And again, part of it was based on the accident and part of it was based on other issues that people became aware of during that time. Looks like I have a duplicate slide here. Interesting. Okay. And we know that ultimately the president did not resign, but was impeached, went to jail. Why? Well, as the newspapers told us, Chae Soon-sil, who also has a second name, I don't remember it now, who was an old friend of Park Geun-hye, had no security clearances, no official position, but she had been giving secret advice. She had been editing and rewriting speeches. She had been doing various things that people questioned, well, we don't even know exactly what all it is. Now, to be fair, I would say that in the United States, this is perfectly legal. There are some security concerns. You can't be told certain things if you don't have a security clearance. But the idea of having somebody else, a friend, help to rewrite your speeches or something, this was not a big deal. For me, when I was in Korea, I couldn't understand why people were concerned. But people were concerned. It was a big deal. So as we mentioned before, there's this candlelight revolution. that lasted for a number of years. Ultimately, as many as 16 million different South Koreans protested peacefully. And some say successfully. The protests were successful in their demand to end the Park Geun-hye presidency. Well, ultimately, she was impeached, and she is in jail. But not for the Sewol-ho. She's in jail for acts as president. And we're not going to get into the question of guilty or not guilty, or was the trial correct, because that's a legislative, political issue that's much too sensitive for this class. All I can say is that probably 35% of Korea, slowly decreasing as people age, older supporters die, but probably 35% of Korea would vote for her again. If she could run for office, they would vote for her again. There is this strong magnetism to the Park legacy, the Park Geun-hye legacy, and of course Park Geun-hye is Park Geun-hye's daughter. In 2019, the protests were political, related to the Minister of Justice, Jo Guk. Well, there's several things happening here, which it was political, and there were two sides to the politics. So the protests were in the hundreds of thousands of people. But there could be two protests on each side of the street. One in favor of Jo Guk and protesting the people who were protesting, and those opposed to Minister Jo Guk. Well, Jo Guk was appointed to reform the prosecution. Everyone knows the prosecution is super powerful in Korea, and there have been a number of presidents who've tried to reform the prosecution, and they have failed. And such reform is ongoing even today. You'll remember that a few months ago, the head of the prosecution service finally resigned and is now one of the leading candidates to become president the next time. Right? I mean, that's the power of the prosecution. Not just the prosecutors and the institution of prosecutor, but the fact that there are so many citizens who believe that the prosecution is being attacked unfairly. That politicians are attacking the prosecution because the prosecution can influence the politicians, can investigate politicians, and politicians don't want to be investigated. So politicians want to create a different kind of specialty sub-prosecution only to investigate politicians. And the prosecution says, no, you're going to capture that and they'll never do their job. So there is this deep, fundamental difference of opinion on the role of the prosecution. That's a fair difference. So we have these deep protests about the question of reforming the prosecution. But that's only part of the issue. There's a second half of the issue. The minister was challenged for personal ethical lapses. Like many of the elite in Korean society, they are able to do things that are not quite legal, and sometimes that gets caught. Ethical lapses by himself, by his wife, and ultimately these things also affected his daughter's benefits in entering medical school and getting scholarships in medical school. I'm not going to speak to the details of the allegations, some of which were proven in court, But what I will say is that the wife, who was a professor at a university, went to jail. Joe Goop has not gone to jail. The nature of the complaints, the allegations of wrongdoing are very, very different between Joe Gook and his wife. But ultimately, it's seen as the elite taking care of themselves, right? That the rules for the rich are not the rules for the poor. And this was why there were so many protests against Joe Gook. A lot of the protests against Joe Gook were not about the politics, but about the man. Okay, so we're going to stop our history of protest here and start to consider, what have we learned? What are our understandings? Well, we can start with one reading, and this is the reading that I pointed to. Let's see if I can find it this way. That doesn't work. I messed it up. Anyway, in our CTL posting, okay, creating government politics, let's just move this down to here, and we click on today's title, you can see there was a lot of reading materials offered. A good overview is a single article, Why Are Street Protests So Common in South Korea? Now this doesn't really provide any details, almost no details, that I've done the history. But it gives you a summary, and I'm going to kind of summarize their summary. And I gave you a lot of newspaper articles about various protests, and I also gave you a couple of longer articles that consider what is happening. Alright, so let's pull this back down. How did that happen? Alright. So that's the article. By the way, The Diplomat is what we could call a magazine for the more educated. It focuses on political issues around the world. It's not a casual, friendly magazine. You won't find it in a store. If you go to a magazine specialty store, you might find it. But basically, mostly, it's a subscription magazine. Alright. So why are street protests so common in South Korea? In U.S., they're extremely rare, although in the last couple of years in the U.S., with the Trump protests, it became more common. Generally not violent. The most common street protests in the United States, it's kind of silly, are sports related. When a sports team wins a championship and their fans go out on the streets and they demonstrate, that's silly. And the other type is policing related, and this has become more common in the past 4 or 5 years. But Korea has a long history of protests. Japan, far fewer, but in the United States in the 1980s, prior to the Olympics, if Americans saw anything on TV about Korea, it was probably related to street protests. And that was part of the image. That was part of the reason why the country wanted to host the Olympics. So why are they so common? In older times, protests, both the candlelight protest and before the candlelight protest, the more violent ones, took place in two main places, at Gwanghwamun or in front of the old city hall. Now, the old city hall had a large open area that was paved, kind of like the front of train stations. And train stations have always been interesting to me because they have these big flat areas which were perfect for demonstrations, perfect for rallies, legal political rallies, illegal rallies. Um, Not something we see in U.S. If we see a flat space like that in U.S., it's probably got cars on it, parking lot. Um, but the old city hall had this huge area that was perfect for demonstrations, and we were protesting, in front of City Hall. Ultimately, they put up a bunch of trees and some modern art and some low fences and bushes to kind of break up this area to make it much harder to have good demonstrations there. Just an aside, a little comment. Well, the history of protest probably comes in part from the fact that we had this authoritarian government, and people didn't really have a way to speak to the government, to society, to say they didn't like something. There was a lack of a strong civil society. Here, civil society means something beyond the village, beyond the, uri maul kind of identification or my high school friends. The next level up, the large NGOs that were something other than labor unions. Organizations that weren't dedicated to political protest, but to helping people to deliver their message. So in the United States, we could say, for example, there are so many clubs dedicated to certain beliefs. The National Rifle Association for gun lovers. The Automobile Club supports driving rights, build better roads. Any kind of social issue or political issue, there are organizations who will lobby legally to try to convince government officials to give you what you want. Korea didn't have a history of that. So coming together in protest was one of the few ways to do it. Now, we should understand that around this same time, we could see in the 80s and the 90s some of these same changes happening in a few other countries. The Philippines were famous for protests, and they used cell phone text messaging to drive out a president and to almost drive out a second president. So we had Korea was not in isolation, but Philippines, the same kind of case. They had a very, very strong president for a long number of years. And later in the late 1990s and the 2000s, we started to see it in Eastern Europe, where again there was a communist party that was very authoritarian, that deprived people of the right to build a civil society where people could communicate with each other and with government about their concerns. And so we saw demonstrations. And in Europe, and in the 2012, I guess it was, the Arab Spring, we started to see more and more protests, and very often they were fairly peaceful. So there was a lot of learning from each other. People in one country could see what happened in another country and follow it. In Korea, one of the protest concerns was that society was highly divided. Okay? Politics followed regions, right? Honam was Uridang, and Yeongnam was Seinuridang. Politics often followed ages. The older people are more conservative. Well, that happens in many countries. But in Korea, part of that is not just a natural aging, getting more conservative, but that these are older people who look back fondly at the time of Bak Chung-hee and Chun Du-hwan because the economy was growing and there weren't many protests. Farmers, factory workers, these various sectors of industry have their own very narrow interest, and government works hard to try to take care of them, but it can't always. A separate major division is not politics but privilege. Right? Gapjil, that people who have more privilege, the golden spoons, take advantage of their privilege, and the dirt spoons have no chance. And so naturally, the people who feel like they are deprived are going to protest. At some point in time, they're going to protest. Some researchers have suggested that Korea's Han is part of the factor behind protest. And they define Han as a deep sense of sorrow and anger because of maybe 5,000 years of injustice, of suffering, of being the small shrimp between two whales, of having the elite walking all over them, giving them no chance. So, people who feel Han feel helpless. It's my fate. These powerful people are just walking over me all the time. My own feeling is that this sense of Han doesn't really explain protest. Maybe it explains candlelight protest. We can't really fight back, but we're going to show our protest with a candle. Perhaps. You've heard me say in class, I'm not Korean enough. I don't think I feel Han. Maybe once or twice. Maybe. At a funeral? Maybe. Not sure. A suggestion that candlelight protests are a symbolic gathering. Okay? It's not really going to do anything. It's just a symbol. And it is a gathering of many. They're a collective gathering. Those two words are kind of redundant. They say almost the same thing. But a gathering of political dissent. That we're going to protest or combat injustice in a peaceful way. We're not going to fight. We're not going to throw stones, attack the police. We're just going to come together peacefully and show that we see things are not fair. Things are not fair. Alemann's research, and that's included in one of the zip files, suggested 2 points. One, political protest has become more routine and less violent. Korea has moved away from the once every other year or so break things, fight the police, tear gas, water cannons. By the way, I'm not showing pictures of those kinds of protests here. That's purposeful. I'm not going to show those. It's not necessary. If you want to see them, you can look it up on the internet. Water cannons that knock people down. Rubber bullets that are not supposed to kill, but can. But protest has become less violent. Now, more often it is the candles or the people standing up and protesting with loudspeakers and hands going up in the air. but no violence, or very less violence. But also more routine, that it's not strange, unusual anymore. It's almost like a parade. Okay, we know that this street is going to be blocked tomorrow because there's going to be, we can announce it in advance. Everybody, most of the protests get permits from City Hall, and that these protests are really concerned about the quality of democracy. Okay? They're not attacking the political system. They're not saying you didn't get elected. They're not saying that you are taking unfair advantage of your office, collecting bribes. They're not saying, oh, this party is forcing this other party to not participate. No, instead they're saying, it's not good enough. You didn't do your job the way the Constitution says you're supposed to. Okay? We don't agree with moving the national capital to Sejong City because you didn't consult with us. Okay, of course the Sejong City protest didn't last for very long because it went to the Constitutional Court and people were willing to give the court a chance and the court decided you can't move it. Right, so that's a good example of how the proposed move of the nation's capital, had that happened 30 years earlier, probably would have had massive demonstrations. But people were more willing to say, let's give the Constitutional Court a chance. So there were some protests, but they were relatively peaceful, and it's not even in our story. Another aspect of political protests or social protests in Korea are the yellow ribbons. I was going to play a little song for you, but it doesn't always work so well in recording. There's a YouTube, you'll see, you can find the song Tie a Yellow Ribbon Around the Old Oak Tree. And this was a song from the 1980s in the US that kind of captured a sentiment, captured a feeling. And the song was actually about a guy getting out of jail and asking his girlfriend to tell him whether he was welcome back home. That if she tied a yellow ribbon on the big tree, he would get off the bus from jail in their town and come to see her. But if there was no yellow ribbon, he would stay on the bus and go to the next city. So that's kind of where that captured the imagination in America. And yellow ribbons were used in many countries to kind of pray for the safe return of soldiers. Soldiers are in, especially, for example, in the Middle East War in 1993, a lot of Americans started wearing yellow ribbons and tying them to poles to pray for the safe return of the soldiers. So yellow ribbons were traditionally used to show the hope of safe return. And that became very important in Korea with the Sewol-ho, where we had these hours, and actually it stretched to days which were far beyond the golden time, but there were still these hopes that somehow the hundreds of high school kids underwater in a ferry would be rescued. So the yellow ribbons were this kind of hope and prayer that the children would be rescued. But ultimately, after the ferry sinking, the hopes that the children would return faded to mourning, recognizing that they must be dead. Ultimately, the ship was raised. Most of the children's bodies were brought back. From hopes to mourning to activism and democratization. And so yellow ribbons became part of the campaign against Park Geun-hye. So these yellow ribbons, which became yellow banners and yellow placards, signs, headbands, yellow headbands. Yellow became the way to find out that this is some place of protest. And if you don't want to get caught up in a protest and you see a bunch of yellow stuff, go somewhere else. So yellow became a sign of protest. Now, maybe you know that in Thailand, yellow is the king's color. And you don't make yellow dirty. Yellow is the king's color. Yellow is a sign of... When there are protests in Thailand, the people who were protesting the government will often wear red. But the people who come out in support of the king will wear yellow shirts, t-shirts, polo shirts. So yellow is very much a protest color in Korea. And if you go back and look at the very top, in our earliest pictures of protest, where were they? Not too much yellow here, but look at the signs. They're mostly yellow. Okay, so wrapping up. Finishing the semester. Again, Thursday at 10:30 a.m. we have a Zoom where we will review the semester, prepare for the final test, and there's question time. Any questions you want to ask, I'll be happy to answer. Just don't ask me what's on the test or how many questions on the test, because I don't answer those. I don't write the final test until the final review is finished. After the final review, I do not accept more questions. That's your last chance to ask questions. The final test will be put up on the CTL, and you download it from the CTL sometime between June 15 to June 21. You complete it offline, and then you send it to me by email. The email information will be on the CTL and will be on the questions. The test is due June 21st. That's a Monday, 11:55 p.m. Now, as you've heard me say, this is a Gyoyan class. This is a liberal studies section class. So the final exams period is a week later than the departmental classes. So we can have more time for the test. And as I told you, my final test is difficult. Please do not plan to start it at 8:30 p.m. on June 21st and turn it in at 11:55 p.m. You'll probably not do a very good job. I don't mean you need 4 hours to do the test, but you need time to look at the test, think about it, maybe go off and do something else, come back, do some more reading, check on the things that we have in the class, think about it, and then write. Okay? There isn't just one simple right answer. Part of the test will be your traditional, multiple choice. But part of it is I want you to write based on things we've talked about in class. It's going to include your ideas. It might include some information that I didn't even talk about. My test is not easy. Don't expect it to be easy. All right. And that is it for today. That's the end of today's lecture, and that is the end of our regular lectures in the semester. Thank you very much, and goodbye.